Captain Sarah Chen stared at the mission roster with trembling hands, her eyes refusing to focus on the names blurring before her. 7 months. 7 months of relentless combat, endless sorties, and a psychological weight that no amount of training could have prepared her for. She'd lost count of how many times she'd climbed into the cockpit of her FA-18 Super Hornet, how many times she'd pushed the throttle to full power, how many times she'd looked down at a landscape, transformed into coordinates and target designations. The operations center was a concrete box disguised as a command center, windowless, fluorescent lit, and perpetually filled with the hum of computers and the static of radio communications. Sarah had spent more hours in this room than she had in her bunk lately. The walls seemed to press in on her, the air recycled so many times that it felt stale and suffocating. She could taste the copper of her own exhaustion on her tongue, bitter and metallic, mixing with the terrible coffee she'd been nursing for the past 3 hours. Outside, the desert heat was beyond description. A thermometer on the building's exterior read 121 degrees Fahrenheit, but that number didn't capture the reality of it. The heat was a living thing, a predatory force that sucked the moisture from your skin, made your thoughts scatter like startled birds, and turned the simplest tasks into ordeals. The tarmac itself was hot enough to burn through shoe soles. The aircraft, when she'd walked past it that morning, was so hot to the touch that her fingertips had been singed despite the brief contact. This was the kind of heat that broke people, that made them question every decision, every choice that had brought them to this God-forsaken place. Sarah had been one of the first women to earn her wings in carrier aviation. Her path to this cockpit had been anything but ordinary. She'd spent her entire childhood watching her grandfather's stories about his fighter pilot days, stories filled with adventure and meaning. While other girls played with dolls, Sarah had built model aircraft and memorized the specifications of every combat jet ever manufactured. In high school, she'd been the girl who didn't fit into any category, too focused on technical knowledge for the popular crowd, too ambitious for the conventional paths her guidance counselor suggested. She'd spent thousands of hours in flight simulators, earning certifications and qualifications that would make her one of the most skilled pilots in the Navy. But nothing could have prepared her for the reality of combat. The simulators never captured the true weight of it. They couldn't replicate the visceral terror of being in a metal tube traveling at supersonic speeds while people below tried to kill you. They couldn't simulate the sound of missile warnings blaring in your cockpit, or the smell of your own fear-induced sweat as you performed evasive maneuvers. They couldn't teach you what it felt like to pull the trigger and know that your decision would change lives, or end them. 7 months into this deployment, Sarah had completed 287 combat sorties. She'd been shot at more times than she could count. She'd watched another aircraft from her squadron go down, watched the parachute deploy, and then watched the recovery teams work through the night. Her friend, Captain Michael Torres, had ejected over hostile territory and spent 6 hours on the ground before extraction. He'd been lucky. Not everyone was. The roster in her hands felt heavier than it should. 2 of her fellow pilots had rotated out just 3 days ago, one for emergency family leave. His father had suffered a massive heart attack back in Virginia. The other had been injured in a hard landing, a structural damage to his landing gear that had gone badly. The Navy medical team had cleared him for no flight operations for at least 2 weeks. She'd hugged them both as they'd left the base, genuinely happy for them, genuinely envious of their escape. Another pilot, Captain David Kim, was in the base hospital with a severe infection in his leg. He'd gotten a cut during a routine maintenance check, ignored it like most pilots did, and now he was lying in a hospital bed on heavy antibiotics, his career hanging in the balance. Sarah had visited him yesterday, and the sight of him, normally so confident, so sharp, lying helpless on that bed had shaken her deeply. Then there were the logistical nightmares. 2 pilots were stationed 50 miles away at a supply depot, managing inventory for the squadron. It was necessary work, but it meant they were unavailable for combat operations. One aircraft was grounded due to critical maintenance issues that had been discovered during inspection. A fuel line was corroded, a hydraulic pump was failing, the landing gear actuators needed complete replacement. No pilot could safely fly that bird. That left 6 pilots who were theoretically available, but Sarah knew better. Captain Rodriguez had been flying double sorties for the past week and had finally collapsed from sheer exhaustion. He was sleeping now, and Sarah had explicit orders not to wake him. Captain Jennifer Hayes was on her final week of deployment, her hands shaking so badly from fatigue that the flight surgeon had quietly recommended no flight operations. Captain Tom Mitchell had just gotten word that his wife was pregnant, their 3rd child, and his mind was clearly elsewhere, wrestling with the guilt of being halfway across the world while his family faced uncertainty back home. That left her and Captain James Whitmore, the newest pilot in the squadron. James was brilliant, but he was also green. This was only his 3rd deployment, and while he'd done well on routine patrols, he'd never handled a complex combat situation. The regulations were clear. Complex combat operations required senior pilots with extensive experience. James could handle defensive support, but not the kind of operation that would come if a crisis emerged. So that's when it hit her, really hit her. Sarah was the senior pilot. She was the experienced one. She was the one with the mental framework to handle chaos and make split-second decisions that meant life and death. She was the only one fully rested, fully capable, fully available. The realization made her physically ill. She stood up from the desk, her legs unsteady, and walked toward the small window at the end of the operations center. She could see the flight line in the distance, could see her aircraft sitting there, gleaming in the brutal sunlight, waiting. Always waiting. She thought about calling home. Her mother would be sleeping now. The time difference meant it was 3 in the morning in Seattle. She thought about her apartment there, with its view of the Puget Sound, with its comfortable silence and rain-soaked mornings. She thought about all the things she'd given up to be here, and the bitter irony that all that sacrifice hadn't been enough. She was still just a woman in a cockpit in the desert, and she was about to lose whatever remained of her sanity. The loudspeaker crackled suddenly, startling her from her thoughts. It was Colonel Rodriguez's voice, urgent and authoritative. All available pilots report to command immediately. This is not a drill. Sarah's hands began to tremble. The briefing room was deliberately nondescript, standard military architecture designed to be functional rather than comfortable. Gray walls, metal folding chairs, a whiteboard filled with logistics and flight schedules, and a projector that hadn't been properly calibrated in months. Sarah walked in with 4 other personnel, all with the same confused expression. Why had Colonel Rodriguez called an emergency briefing in the middle of the afternoon? The roster had been set this morning. The sortie assignments had been distributed. There was nothing on the schedule that required this level of urgency. Colonel Marcus Rodriguez was standing at the front of the room, silhouetted against the bright projection screen. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s, someone who'd seen combat before the Gulf War, during the Gulf War, and continuously since. His hair was gray, his face etched with the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying the weight of other people's lives for decades. Sarah had enormous respect for him, but she'd also learned to be afraid of the expressions he made. The one he wore now, a tight jaw, eyes slightly closed, as if he was mentally reciting something to give himself strength, meant nothing good. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I'm going to lay out a situation for you, and I want you to understand that we're going to solve it together. We're going to find a solution because that's what we do." He paused, letting that statement settle over the room. "We have a crisis brewing, and we need to be honest about our current capacity." He turned to the whiteboard behind him, where someone had already written out the flight roster in meticulous detail. Sarah's eyes scanned the names: Rodriguez, Chen, Whitmore, Hayes, Mitchell, Torres, Kim, Jackson. 8 pilots total. But as her gaze traveled down the list, she saw annotations next to each name, small notes that spelled out a disaster in slow motion. Torres, Rodriguez said, pointing at the first name on the list. Rotated out 3 days ago. Family medical emergency. We all know he needed to go. The colonel's voice was matter-of-fact, but there was an undertone of regret. Torres had been one of the best pilots in the squadron. Losing him had been like losing a limb. Jackson, he continued. Hard landing last week. Structural damage, landing gear malfunction that went sideways. Medical has cleared him for desk duty only. No flight operations for a minimum of 2 weeks. Jackson had actually broken his collarbone during the ejection sequence when the landing had gone bad. Sarah had seen him limping around the base yesterday, his arm in a sling, looking like a ghost of himself. Kim, Rodriguez said, and his voice dropped slightly. Hospital, infection in his leg. It started as a small cut during maintenance, but it progressed faster than anyone expected. He's on heavy antibiotics, and we won't know for at least another week whether he'll be flight-capable again. Sarah had visited David the day before. He'd been delirious with fever, barely coherent. The medical officer had pulled her aside afterward and given her the real prognosis in a whisper. If the infection didn't respond to the antibiotics within 48 hours, they might lose his leg. Mitchell and Hayes, Rodriguez said, his eyes moving to the next section of the board. Both still technically available, but both compromised. Mitchell's wife is pregnant with their 3rd child. He's receiving family notifications multiple times daily. His focus is understandably divided. Hayes is at the end of a brutal 7-month cycle. The flight surgeon has quietly recommended no operations for at least 3 days until she can get some proper sleep. Sarah felt the room starting to close in on her. She knew where this was going, and her stomach was beginning to twist into knots. That leaves us with supply depot assignments, Rodriguez continued relentlessly. Rodriguez and Sanchez are stationed 50 miles north managing inventory. They can't be here in less than an hour, and any combat operation needs immediate response, so they're effectively unavailable for crisis situations. The colonel set down his marker and turned to face the room directly. His eyes met Sarah's for a fraction of a second longer than anyone else's. That leaves 6 pilots, he said quietly. But the regulations are clear. Complex combat operations require senior pilots with substantial experience. We can't send a junior pilot into a high-risk situation without experienced backup. It violates every protocol we have, and frankly, it's unconscionable. Sarah's mouth had gone completely dry. She could feel her heart beginning to accelerate, could feel her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. She was doing the math in her head, running the numbers like she'd done so many times before, but this time the answer was different. This time the answer was her. Captain Whitmore, Rodriguez said, and the young pilot, couldn't be more than 30, straightened in his chair. You're our junior pilot. Excellent work, excellent potential, but you're still building experience. I'm not sending you alone into a complex operation. That's not happening. Whitmore nodded, relief and disappointment crossing his face simultaneously. That leaves, Rodriguez said, and he paused for what felt like an eternity, Captain Sarah Chen. The silence in the room was absolute. Sarah felt every eye turn toward her. She could feel her pulse in her temples, could feel the blood rushing to her face. She wanted to protest, wanted to say something, anything, but her voice had disappeared. You're our senior pilot, Rodriguez said, speaking directly to her now. You have the most experience. You have the most flight hours. You have handled every type of complex situation in your career. You are the only pilot in this room who I can ethically and legally assign to a high-risk combat operation right now. Sarah opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. But sir, she heard herself say, I'm exhausted. I've flown 3 sorties this week alone. My reaction time might be better than anyone else available, Rodriguez interrupted gently. I know you're tired, Captain, we're all tired. But tired is better than compromised, and it's better than dead, and that's what we're looking at. He walked closer to her, and his voice became very quiet, meant only for her. I'm not going to order you to fly if you tell me you're unfit. That's not how I operate. But I am telling you that you are the only pilot I have who can do this. You are the only one." Sarah felt the weight of command settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. All the training, all the preparation, all the sacrifices she'd made had been leading to this moment. This moment where she was the only one. This moment where her country needed her to be more than human. "I understand, sir," she heard herself say. "Good," Rodriguez replied, "because I have a feeling we're about to need you very soon. Combat readiness is up to maximum alert. Any moment now, we could get a call we can't refuse." As if on cue, the loudspeaker crackled. An operator's voice came through, tight with stress. "Command, this is TOC. We have an incoming transmission from a Marine unit in the field. They're reporting enemy contact. Stand by." Sarah's entire body went cold. Rodriguez's eyes met hers across the room. "Get to the ready room, Captain. I have a feeling your day is about to get very complicated." Sarah stood up on legs that felt like rubber and walked out of the briefing room, already running through pre-flight checklists in her mind. Behind her, Colonel Rodriguez sat down heavily in one of the folding chairs, looking every one of his 50-some years. "God help us all," he whispered to the empty room. The transmission came through at 11:47 hours, cutting through the routine static of the communications center like a blade. The operator's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the underlying current of panic in the way he spoke, in the slightly elevated pitch that betrayed his stress. "TOC, this is Bravo Company, call sign Hammer 6. We have a situation. We have troops in contact. Repeat, troops in contact. We are receiving enemy fire from multiple positions. Request immediate air support." The operations center, which had been operating at a low hum of routine activity, suddenly felt like it had been struck by lightning. Every person in the room suddenly had heightened awareness. Fingers flew across keyboards. Radio operators leaned closer to their headsets. Colonel Rodriguez, who had been reviewing a personnel file at his desk, stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward and crashed into the wall. Sarah was still in the ready room, beginning the preliminary checks on her flight suit, when she heard the call over the loudspeaker. Her hands stopped moving. She stood motionless, listening as the situation unfolded over the radio. "Bravo Company, this is TOC. Say status. How many friendlies? How many hostiles? What is your current position?" The TOC operator, Sarah recognized his voice as Lieutenant Commander Blake, was already pulling up the tactical map on the main display. "TOC, Bravo Company is a 12-man patrol unit. We are currently engaged in the Valley Grid coordinates Lima 479er324. We have heavy enemy contact. Estimate 3 to 4 contacts on Northern Ridge, 2 to 3 on Eastern Ridge. We are pinned down in the valley floor with limited cover. We have return fire capability, but ammunition is limited. How long until air support?" Sarah's stomach clenched. The valley. She knew that valley. It was narrow, steep-sided, and notoriously difficult to navigate. It was exactly the kind of place where ambushes worked perfectly. If the Marines had gone in pursuing a target and the enemy had flanked them, they would be trapped like fish in a barrel. "Bravo Company, TOC. Air support is being scrambled. Stand by." There was a brief pause. Then Captain James Martinez's voice came back, and it was different now. No longer the controlled, professional military cadence, but something rower, something desperate. "TOC, this is Hammer 6, actual. Listen to me carefully. We did not expect this level of contact. We pursued what we thought was a small element, maybe 3 or 4 fighters. Instead, we walked into a prepared position with significant forces. The enemy knows we're here, they have the high ground, and they are using that advantage effectively. We have taken 1 wounded already. Corporal Henderson took a round in the shoulder. He's stabilized, but we need medical evacuation capability." Sarah felt her training kick in. 1 wounded. That meant the Marines were already degraded in capability. Someone would have to assist Henderson. That meant 11 effective combatants instead of 12. The math kept getting worse. "How is Henderson's condition?" Blake asked. "Conscious and communicating. Bleeding is controlled, but he needs to be extracted within the next hour or we're looking at serious complications. The heat is working against us, and infection risk is high." Sarah was moving now, her body responding to the crisis even as her mind was still processing the information. She walked quickly down the corridor toward the operations center, every instinct telling her that this was going to escalate. "What about ammunition status?" Blake continued his questioning, gathering intelligence with the precision of a trained operator. "We have approximately 200 rounds per man remaining. At current rate of fire, that gives us maybe 20 to 30 minutes of sustained engagement if they keep pressing. After that, we're looking at hand-to-hand or surrender. Neither option is acceptable." The words hung in the air like a curse. 20 to 30 minutes. That was the window. That was how long these 12 men could hold out. "Bravo Company, what about exit route? Can you egress from the valley?" There was a longer pause this time. Sarah could imagine Martinez looking at his map, studying the terrain, running through scenarios. "Negative TOC. We came in from the south. Enemy is dug in across our exit route. We attempt to leave, we're in open ground with no cover. They have snipers positioned. We take massive casualties trying to egress. We're staying put, holding position, and we need air support." Sarah pushed through the doors into the operations center. All eyes turned toward her. Colonel Rodriguez looked up from the tactical display, his expression grim. "Martinez," Blake said, "describe the enemy positions in detail. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with." "TOC, the northern ridge has a series of fortified positions. Looks like they've been here for a while, built into the rock formations. Heavy machine gun emplacement, multiple assault rifle positions. The eastern ridge is less developed but has good sightlines and sniper capability. Enemy is coordinated, professional, and they're using tactics that suggest military training. This isn't a ragtag militia, TOC. This is organized." Sarah's pulse was racing now. Organized enemy forces, professional soldiers. This wasn't a simple support mission. This was a potential disaster unfolding in real time, and 12 American lives hung in the balance. "Bravo Company," Blake said, "we are working on getting you air support. Stand by." Rodriguez turned to look directly at Sarah. Their eyes met across the operations center, and without a word being spoken, they both understood the situation completely. This was the crisis they'd been preparing for. This was the moment that couldn't wait for other options. "Martinez," Rodriguez said, stepping forward to take the microphone from Blake. His voice was calm, authoritative, the voice of a commander who had done this many times before. "This is Colonel Rodriguez, TOC commander. Help is on the way. I have a senior pilot being prepped right now. How long can you hold?" "Sir, honestly, 10 minutes if they press hard. Maybe 15 if they're cautious. But they're not being cautious. They're coordinating attacks, trying to overwhelm us with suppressive fire. My men are doing their best, but we're outnumbered, outpositioned, and running out of time." "Understood, Bravo Company. Air support will be wheels up in 05 minutes. Pilot will be in station in approximately 12 to 15 minutes from launch. You need to hold for that window. Can you do that?" There was a pause. Sarah could hear the sound of gunfire in the background of the transmission, the sharp cracks of rifle fire, the heavier boom of machine gun fire. "Sir, we'll do our best, but at 10 minutes we're looking at critical status. Some of my men are going to die if we don't get support soon. No pressure, but we're counting on whoever you're sending." Rodriguez looked at Sarah. "Then we better not let them down." He pressed the transmit button again. "Bravo Company, Hammer 6, I am personally confirming that our best pilot is being sent to support you. She has the training, the experience, and the capability to end this situation. Help is coming. Maintain position and keep your heads down." "Thank you, sir. We're standing by." The transmission ended, leaving only the hiss of static in the operations center. Rodriguez turned to Sarah. "Get to your aircraft, Captain. Those men are counting on you." Sarah didn't say anything. She simply nodded and ran. The ready room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning unit and the distant sound of aircraft engines on the flight line. Sarah sat in the worn leather chair, the same chair where pilots had sat for the past 2 decades, waiting for their moment, and stared at the mission brief in her hands. The paper seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. Her vision kept blurring as she tried to focus on the tactical details, the coordinates, the enemy positions. But her mind kept returning to the same thought, cycling through it like a broken record: 12 men, 12 lives, 12 families. She tried to read the words on the page, but they seemed to rearrange themselves. The coordinates became faces. The enemy positions became the faces of men who would die if she made a mistake. The damage assessment became the faces of widows and orphans and parents who would never see their sons again. Her hands were shaking, not the tremor of fear, though she was certainly afraid, but the deeper tremor of understanding the full weight of what was about to happen. She had flown combat missions before. She had faced enemy fire before. She had seen things in the sky that would give most people nightmares for the rest of their lives. But this was different. This was the moment where the abstract became concrete, where the theoretical became real, where the training transformed into actual human consequences. A junior pilot walked past and nodded respectfully. Sarah barely noticed. She was lost in her own mind, running through scenarios, calculating angles, imagining failure in 100 different ways. What if her targeting computer malfunctioned? What if she misjudged the distance and hit friendlies instead of enemies? What if she froze? What if she made the wrong decision at a critical moment? What if, despite everything she'd learned and trained for, she just couldn't do it? The mission brief was comprehensive. The intelligence officer had done excellent work pulling together real-time data. She had photographs of the valley, topographical maps showing exact elevation changes, the specific grid coordinates where the Marines were positioned, best estimates of enemy locations based on radio direction finding. Everything was there. Everything was precise. Everything except the one thing that truly mattered: her own certainty. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember her training. The instructor at Top Gun had told her something once, in a moment of quiet conversation after a particularly brutal simulation. "The mission isn't about being fearless," he'd said. "The mission is about controlling your fear. It's about understanding that the stakes are real, accepting that people could die, and then deciding to do it anyway. That's courage. Not the absence of fear, but action despite it." She opened her eyes and looked down at the brief again. The coordinates were clear. She could memorize them in seconds. The enemy positions were marked with red X's on the tactical map. The friendly positions were marked with blue squares. The valley was narrow, only about 200 meters across at its widest point. That meant her margin for error was incredibly small. One mistake, and 12 American soldiers would die because of her actions. The mathematics of it was almost too much to contemplate. She'd done the calculations during her flight training, how many milliseconds it took a round from her cannon to travel from her aircraft to a target on the ground, how much drift and deviation could occur, how critical the pilot's accuracy and focus had to be. It all came down to her. Every variable, every decision, every split-second judgment call, it all came back to her. A knock on the door. Major Patricia Williams, the weapons officer, stepped into the ready room. She was one of the few people in the squadron who had been with Sarah since the beginning of this deployment. They'd flown together, eaten together, shared the dark humor that pilots develop to cope with the stress of combat. "You okay?" Patricia asked, sitting down in the chair next to Sarah's. Sarah wanted to laugh. Was she okay? Was anyone ever really okay in a situation like this? But she just shook her head slightly. "No," Sarah admitted, "not really." Patricia nodded, understanding perfectly. 12 guys out there are betting their lives that you're better than you think you are. "What if I'm not?" Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. What if I've reached the limit of my capability, and these 12 men die because I wasn't good enough? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned forward. You want to know what I think? I think you're the most disciplined, most focused, most capable pilot I've ever served with. I think you've already been tested in combat multiple times, and you've never failed. I think those 12 Marines have the best possible chance of survival because you're the one going to get them. But what if? There is no what if, Patricia interrupted. There's only what you're about to do, and you're going to do it perfectly because you're a professional, and that's what professionals do when the stakes are highest. Sarah wanted to believe her. She desperately wanted to believe her, but the weight wouldn't lift. It sat on her chest like a physical thing, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. She stood up and walked to the small window at the end of the ready room. From there, she could see her aircraft, the FA-18 Super Hornet gleaming in the afternoon sun. The ground crew was already performing final checks, loading ammunition, configuring the weapons systems. In less than 5 minutes, she would strap herself into that cockpit and point it toward a valley where 12 men were fighting for their lives. You know what I realized? Sarah said quietly, still looking at her aircraft. All those years of training, all those simulations, all those practice sorties, they were all preparation for exactly this moment. For when there would be no backup, no second chances, no margin for error. For when it would just be me and my decisions and the consequences of those decisions. Yes, Patricia said, that's exactly right, and you're ready for it. Sarah turned to look at her friend. How can you be so sure? Because I've watched you fly, Patricia said simply, and you're the best I've ever seen. The loudspeaker crackled. Captain Chen, you are go for launch. Repeat, you are go for launch. Report to your aircraft immediately. Sarah's stomach clenched. This was it. This was the moment when thinking ended and doing began. She stood up, tucked the mission brief under her arm, and took a deep breath. Okay, she said to Patricia. 12 Marines, I can do this. She said it more to convince herself than anyone else. The walk to the flight line felt like it took both 30 seconds and 30 minutes. Sarah's mind seemed to be operating in two-time modes simultaneously. The rational, focused military mind that was reviewing procedures and calculating angles, and the emotional mind that kept circling back to the same terrifying thought. 12 lives, 12 families, 12 reasons to not make a single mistake. The ground crew saw her coming and immediately sprang into action. The ladder was positioned. The flight suit was straightened. A young airman handed her a water bottle and she drank deeply, though her mouth was so dry the water barely seemed to help. She climbed the ladder to the cockpit. The aircraft felt different today, not just a machine, but something living, something breathing, something that would carry her into the most important moment of her life. As she lowered herself into the seat, as the harness came down and locked her in place, as her hands moved through the pre-flight checks with absolute mechanical precision, Sarah allowed herself one moment of clarity. I am Captain Sarah Chen, she whispered to herself. I am a fighter pilot, I am trained, I am ready, and I will not fail. The engine started with a roar that seemed to shake the entire world. The catapult officer appeared at the side of the cockpit, a young enlisted man with sweat already dripping down his face despite the early afternoon hour. He gave her the signal, a sharp motion that meant, "Are you ready?" Sarah gave the thumbs up and began her final system checks. Her hands moved through the procedures with the automaticity of perfect repetition. Hydraulics green, electrical systems green, fuel flow nominal. Weapons systems armed and ready. The targeting computer was online, the navigation systems were calibrated, the communication systems were hot. Everything was where it needed to be. Everything was aligned. Everything was ready except her mind, which was still spiraling between confidence and terror. She locked her harness and pulled it tight, feeling the restraints dig into her shoulders. The harness would keep her from being crushed by G-forces when she maneuvered the aircraft. It would also trap her inside if something went catastrophically wrong. She tried not to think about that. The flight deck crew swarmed around the aircraft with practiced efficiency. They moved the aircraft forward into the catapult shuttle, locking it into place with mechanical precision. The shuttle was a track that ran along the flight deck, powered by enormous steam pressure. In approximately 2 seconds, it would accelerate her aircraft from 0 to 160 miles per hour, launching her into the sky. The G-forces associated with that acceleration would be approximately 5 gs, 5 times her body weight pressing down on her from all directions. She'd experienced it hundreds of times before. It never got easier. Sarah took a deep breath and placed her hands on the stick. Through her headset, she could hear the cacophony of flight deck communications, the flight operations officer coordinating with the catapult crew, the launch control officer confirming all systems, the other personnel on the deck verifying that everything was clear. The noise was familiar, almost comforting in its complexity. It meant that she wasn't alone in this. There were hundreds of people who had contributed to this moment, who had prepared the aircraft, who had trained her, who were now supporting her mission. "Flight Ops, this is Hammer 7, she transmitted. "All systems nominal, I am go for launch." "Hammer 7, Flight Ops confirms go for launch. You are cleared for immediate departure. Stand by for catapult." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could see her oxygen mask moving with the force of it. She tried to regulate her breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The breathing technique was something her instructor had taught her years ago, a way to trick your body into believing that everything was under control. The flight deck officer made the final hand signal. This was it. This was the moment. Sarah pushed the throttles to full afterburner. The engines screamed to life with a roar that seemed to shake the entire world. The aircraft vibrated with barely contained power, straining against the hold of the catapult shuttle like a predator on a leash. Then, the catapult fired. The acceleration was instantaneous and absolute. The world compressed into a single point of pressure and noise and velocity. Her vision went gray at the edges as the G-forces slammed her backward into her seat. It felt like being inside an explosion, like being crushed under the weight of a mountain. The flight deck blurred beneath her, and then suddenly there was nothing beneath her at all. The sky opened up and she was flying. The aircraft climbed at an angle that would have been impossible for any other aircraft. Only the Super Hornet had the combination of thrust and aerodynamic design to climb this steeply, this fast. The altitude gauge spun like a dial on a speedometer. 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 5,000 feet. The pressure in her chest began to normalize as her body adjusted to the G-forces. Her breathing returned to something approaching normal. "Hammer 7, Flight Ops, you have departure clearance. Climb to flight level 240 and maintain heading 190. "Flight Ops, Hammer 7, climbing to flight level 240, maintaining 190, Sarah responded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She continued climbing, the aircraft rising through increasingly thinner air. At 8,000 feet, she could see the landscape spread out below her, the base getting smaller, the desert stretching out in all directions, a seemingly endless expanse of sand and rock. At 12,000 feet, she could see the distant mountains where the valley was located. At 18,000 feet, her cruising altitude, she could see the entire region, from the base in one direction to the distant horizon in others. The climb took exactly 11 minutes. "Hammer 7 TOC," came the transmission from the Tactical Operations Center. It was Colonel Rodriguez himself. "What is your current status? ETA to target." "TOC, Hammer 7, Sarah responded. "I am level at flight level 240. Navigation systems are locked on target coordinates. ETA to target is approximately 4 minutes. Request current situation update." There was a brief pause. Then Martinez's voice came through, and it sounded worse than it had before. There was more gunfire in the background, and his breathing was heavier, more labored. Hammer 7, Bravo Company. We are still holding position, but the enemy is pressing harder. I have 2 Marines with gunshot wounds now. We've managed to stabilize them, but they need medical evacuation soon. Our ammunition is down to critical levels. We can probably sustain another 8 to 10 minutes of engagement before we're forced to cease fire. After that, we become targets. Sarah's stomach clenched. 8 to 10 minutes, and she was still 4 minutes away. Bravo Company, Hammer 7, she transmitted. I understand your situation. I am inbound at high speed. I will arrive on station in approximately 3:40 from now. I need you to hold just a few more minutes. Can you do that? Hammer 7, Bravo Company Actual. We'll do our best. Just get here fast. TOC, Hammer 7, Sarah said, addressing Colonel Rodriguez directly. Request confirmation on rules of engagement. I have enemy positions marked in the northern and eastern ridges. Friendlies are in the valley floor. Confirm that I am clear to engage targets in those ridge positions. Hammer 7, TOC, Rodriguez responded. Affirmative. You are cleared to engage all enemy positions in the northern and eastern ridges. Watch for civilian presence. Intelligence indicates minimal civilian activity in the area, but verify targets before engagement. Your call sign is Reaper. You have full authority for weapons employment. TOC, Hammer 7 copies all, Sarah acknowledged. Reaper is weapons hot and inbound. She adjusted her heading slightly, pointing the aircraft toward the valley coordinates. Through her heads-up display, the targeting information was already feeding in. The enemy positions highlighted in red, the friendly positions highlighted in blue. The valley itself was a thin blue line cutting through the red rock formations. At 3,000 feet altitude, still approaching the target, Sarah could see the valley in the distance. Even from this height, even at this distance, she could see the evidence of combat. There was smoke rising from the northern ridge where enemy positions were dug in. She could see the muzzle flashes of gunfire from the ridges, visible even in daylight against the dark rock. And somewhere down in that narrow valley, 12 Marines were fighting for their lives. Bravo Company, Reaper, she transmitted. I have visual on your location. I am descending to attack position. Stand by. Reaper, Bravo Company, Martinez responded. We see you. Thank God we see you. Sarah's jaw clenched. There was desperation in Martinez's voice, raw and real. He was no longer speaking as a military commander managing a tactical situation. He was speaking as a man who could see his own death approaching and had just witnessed the arrival of his only chance of survival. She didn't allow herself to think about the weight of that. She didn't allow herself to contemplate what it meant that those 12 men's fates now rested entirely on her decisions and her actions in the next few minutes. Instead, she focused on what she'd been trained to do. She banked the aircraft hard to the left, rolling toward attack position. The G-meter spiked as she pulled on the stick, and her body was suddenly compressed again, pressed hard into her seat by the forces of her own maneuvering. Reaper is going in hot, she announced. And she pointed the nose of her aircraft toward the valley below. The valley rose up to meet her like the open mouth of some ancient predator. From 12,000 feet, descending at nearly 400 miles per hour, Sarah could see every detail with crystalline clarity. The targeting computer was already painting the landscape in her mind, overlaying tactical information across her visual field, highlighting threats, calculating angles and distances and trajectories. The infrared strobes from the Marine positions pulsed like heartbeats in her targeting display. 12 men, 12 blue squares on her tactical map, clustered together in the valley floor, surrounded by the sharp red rocks that formed the ridge positions. She could see the enemy positions now, not just marked on a map, but actual visible positions carved into the rocky slopes. A fortified emplacement on the northern ridge, probably housing a heavy machine gun. Multiple assault rifle positions scattered across both ridges, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Sniper nests, communication points. The enemy had built a deadly architecture, a perfect trap. Bravo Company Reaper, Sarah transmitted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. I have visual on your position. I am identifying target coordinates now. Stand by for weapons employment. Reaper Bravo Company Actual, Martinez responded immediately. We see you overhead. Enemy fire has intensified in the past minute. They know you're here. We can't hold much longer. Please advise when you are ready to engage. Sarah's hands moved across her control stick and weapons panel with the precision of a surgeon. She was at 8,000 feet now, and the valley was growing larger with each passing second. The targeting computer was feeding her data: wind speed, air density, target range, movement vectors. Everything a pilot needed to turn a moment of violence into a moment of precision. But precision was exactly what she didn't have room for error in. The valley was narrow. The Marines were in that valley. The enemy was on the ridges surrounding the valley. One miscalculation, one moment of hesitation, one mistake in judgment could mean friendly fire casualties. It could mean hitting the Marines instead of the enemy. It could mean the very worst outcome, saving some Marines only to kill others. The weight of that reality nearly crushed her. Reaper, stand by, Colonel Rodriguez's voice came through her headset. I need confirmation on target coordinates before weapons employment. What is your assessment of enemy positions? Sarah's eyes were locked on the valley. She was descending through 7,000 feet now, and the details were becoming even more apparent. She could see the enemy fortifications with stunning clarity. The northern ridge had what looked like a prepared position, sandbagged, reinforced, with a clear field of fire down into the valley. The eastern ridge was more scattered, less organized, but with multiple firing positions that covered different angles. TOC, Reaper, she transmitted, her professional military voice masking the absolute terror running through her nervous system. I have visual confirmation on Northern Ridge fortification. Estimated 4 to 6 personnel in heavily prepared position. Estimated 2 to 3 personnel on Eastern Ridge in less prepared positions. All positions show clear firing lines into friendly valley position. Recommend immediate engagement of Northern Ridge position as priority target due to weapon system capability and threat level. Reaper TOC copies, Rodriguez responded. You are cleared hot on Northern Ridge priority target. Confirm that southern flank is clear of enemy personnel before you commit to attack run. Sarah banked the aircraft slightly, bringing the southern approach into her field of view. The southern flank was clear, just rock and desert and empty space. That was good. That was the one direction where she didn't have to worry about hitting something she shouldn't. She was at 6,000 feet now, still descending, still approaching at high speed. The tactical computer was locking onto the target coordinates, painting a targeting box around the enemy emplacement on the northern ridge. The box was growing tighter, more defined, as the computer refined its calculations based on her current approach vector. Bravo Company Reaper, Sarah called out. I am beginning first attack run. Remain in defensive positions. Do not expose yourselves. I will make multiple passes to neutralize threats. Reaper Bravo Company copies, Martinez responded. We are hunkered down. Do your thing. We're counting on you. Sarah took a deep breath. This was it. This was the moment where all the training, all the preparation, all the hours in the simulator transformed into actual combat. She had run this scenario hundreds of times. She knew the procedures. She knew the tactics. She knew exactly what needed to happen. But knowing and doing were two different things. At 5,000 feet, she rolled the aircraft hard to the left, beginning her attack approach. The valley spun beneath her as she maneuvered into position. Her G-suit inflated automatically, compressing her legs and abdomen to keep blood from pooling in her lower body as the G-forces mounted. Her breathing became shallow, controlled, mechanical. The targeting computer locked solid. A steady tone in her headset indicated that she had a valid weapons solution. The targeting box around the enemy emplacement turned from yellow to green, indicating that the system had confidence in the target coordinates. Sarah's hand moved to the weapon's control. The 20mm cannon was her primary weapon for this run. The cannon could deliver precision fire with incredible accuracy. Bullets instead of missiles meant less chance of collateral damage. Bullets meant controllable fire. At 4,000 feet, the valley detail became almost overwhelming. She could see individual rocks now. She could see what might have been a person moving behind the sandbags of the fortified position. She could see the barrel of what was probably a machine gun pointing up at her aircraft. At 3,000 feet, she began to shallow her dive. She needed to be pointed downward but not too steeply, needed to have a clear line to the target, needed to ensure she could recover the aircraft after weapons employment. At 2,000 feet, the targeting computer updated its firing solution one more time. At 1,500 feet, Sarah made the decision that would define the next 23 minutes of her life. She aligned the aircraft perfectly with the target, made a final confirmation that the firing solution was locked, and pressed the trigger. The cannon roared to life. The sound was unlike anything in the civilian world, a deep, mechanical thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. The aircraft shuddered as the rounds fired, recoiling slightly with each burst of the weapon. Through her targeting display, she could see the rounds impacting the target area. Red dust erupted from the northern ridge. The sandbags of the fortified position exploded into fragments. The machine gun emplacement was torn to pieces. "Guns, guns, guns," Sarah transmitted, the standard call indicating that she had employed kinetic weapons. The professional terminology didn't match the reality of what was happening. People down there were dying. Not theoretical targets, not abstract enemies, but actual human beings who had been trying to kill the Marines moments ago and were now being killed by her actions. She couldn't allow herself to process that. She couldn't afford the luxury of moral reflection. She had committed to this action, and she had to see it through. At 500 feet above the ground, the cockpit vibrating with the force of her cannon fire, Sarah pulled back hard on the control stick. The G-forces slammed her into her seat with crushing force. The world spun as she executed a climbing turn, pulling the aircraft up and away from the valley floor. "Northern Ridge neutralized," she announced to the command frequency. "Coming around for assessment. Bravo Company, what is your status?" There was a brief pause. Then Martinez's voice came through, and it sounded different now. It sounded like someone who had just been pulled back from the edge of the abyss. "Reaper, Bravo Company. Enemy fire from the Northern Ridge has ceased. Repeat, Northern Ridge is silent. Eastern Ridge is still active. You are our lifeline down here. Keep it up." Sarah was already banking around for another pass, already lining up the Eastern Ridge in her targeting system, already preparing to commit to another attack run. The battle had begun in earnest. The aircraft pulled up hard, and Sarah's vision compressed to a narrow point at the center of her field of view as the G-forces peaked at nearly 7 GS. Her body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Every muscle in her core was locked tight by the G-suit. Every breath was a conscious effort against the crushing pressure. But her hands remained steady on the controls, and her mind remained focused on the next task. The Eastern Ridge. The threat was still there, still active, still deadly. She could see the muzzle flashes from the Eastern Ridge now, visible even in daylight, small orange pinpricks of fire that marked enemy positions. The Marines down in the valley were pinned, unable to advance, unable to retreat, dependent entirely on her intervention. "Reaper coming back around for second pass," Sarah announced, her voice tight but controlled. "Eastern Ridge is target, stand by." She banked the aircraft hard to the right, the wing tip nearly vertical as she carved a tight turn through the desert air. The G-forces mounted again, and her G-suit responded automatically, inflating to keep her conscious. The training took over. the thousands of hours in simulators and actual combat creating a neural pathway so deeply grooved that fear had no room to intrude. At 4,000 feet, descending on the eastern ridge, Sarah could see the enemy positions more clearly now. They were less fortified than the northern position, scattered across the slope, probably created hastily when the ambush was sprung. That made them less of a coordinated threat, but it also made them harder to target with precision. Multiple positions meant multiple attack runs. Multiple runs meant more time in the danger zone. Enemy fire began reaching toward her aircraft. She could hear the occasional round impacting the fuselage, small, sharp sounds like pebbles being thrown against metal. Most rounds missed. The aircraft was small, fast, and maneuverable. The enemy was using small arms fire against a military jet traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. The mathematics of the engagement strongly favored her. But mathematics was only theory. Reality was the possibility of one lucky shot hitting something critical, a hydraulic line, an engine inlet, the cockpit. Sarah pushed that thought away and focused on her targeting solution. At 2,500 feet, she aligned her aircraft with a cluster of enemy positions on the eastern ridge. The targeting computer locked solid. The confirmation tone sounded in her headset. She was ready. She pressed the trigger again. The cannon roared to life. The 20mm rounds tore through the air at supersonic speed, covering the distance between her aircraft and the target in microseconds. The enemy positions erupted in chaos. Rock fragments exploded outward. One of the enemy fighters was struck directly. She could see his body flung backward by the impact of the rounds. The professional part of her mind registered that as a successful weapons employment. The human part of her mind flinched away from the implications. "Second run complete," she transmitted. "Eastern ridge positions degraded." But not eliminated. She could still see muzzle flashes from other positions on the ridge. The enemy was adapting, spreading out, making themselves smaller targets. She climbed away from the valley again, executing another hard pulling maneuver to regain altitude for a third pass. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel the pulse in her neck. The adrenaline in her system was creating a kind of hyper-awareness, where every detail seemed sharp and clear and simultaneously unreal, like she was watching a movie rather than living it. "Bravo Company, situation report," she called out between attack runs. Martinez's response came back faster than she expected. "Reaper, we are holding position. Your fire is effective. Enemy is less coordinated now, more scattered, but we still have active threats on the eastern ridge. Continue engagement. We are not taking direct fire from the northern position anymore, so your first pass was very successful." 11 minutes had elapsed since she'd begun her attack runs. She'd made 2 effective passes. The northern ridge was neutralized, but the eastern ridge was still a threat, and she had an unknown amount of time before the Marines' ammunition ran completely out or before they were overwhelmed. She couldn't hesitate. She couldn't second-guess herself. She could only continue the attack. The third pass came in from a different angle, approaching the eastern ridge from the south and banking hard to line up the remaining enemy positions. At 3,000 feet altitude, Sarah could see the terrain in stunning detail. She could see the rocks that the enemy fighters were using for cover. She could see the muzzle flashes coming from those positions. She could almost see the fear in the eyes of the men trying to kill her. Her cannon fire raked across the ridge, tearing apart the remaining prepared positions. But there was always more. Always another position further back. Always another fighter scrambling to reorganize. The enemy was learning to spread out, to avoid clustering together, to use the terrain more effectively. Sarah's jaw was clenched so tightly it ached. She was running the calculations in her head, how much ammunition she had left, how much longer she could maintain attack runs before she would need to return to base to rearm. The math was getting uncomfortable. She had enough weapons for maybe 2 more effective passes before she would need to break contact. 2 more passes to finish what she'd started. "Bravo Company, this is Reaper," she transmitted, already banking around for the 4th pass. "I have limited ammunition remaining. I am making 2 more attack runs, and then I will need to return to base for rearming. You need to be prepared to either break contact during that time or hold in place. Do you understand?" There was a brief pause. Then Martinez came back, and his voice was steady now, no longer panicked. "Reaper, Bravo Company copies. We understand. 2 more runs. Make them count. The northern ridge is secure because of you. 1 more ridge cleared and we can move to extraction." Sarah felt something crystallize inside her. 2 more passes. That was the commitment. That was what stood between these 12 Marines and the possibility of death. At 3,500 feet on the 4th attack run, Sarah was already reading the targeting computer's data before the aircraft was even properly aligned. She had learned the rhythm of the combat now. She knew which positions were threats and which were decoys. She knew where the heavy weapons were likely to be and where the riflemen would cluster. The cannon fire from the 4th pass was the most intense yet. She held the trigger longer, poured more rounds into the target area, created a pattern of fire that made it impossible for the enemy to maintain organized resistance. The eastern ridge was torn to pieces. Rocks exploded. Enemy fortifications were shattered. The coordinated fire that had been pinning down the Marines disintegrated into scattered, desperate return fire. At 2,000 feet, Sarah could see individual Marines in the valley looking up at her aircraft. She could see them pointing, see them cheering even though she couldn't hear them. In that moment, the abstract concept of saving lives transformed into something concrete and real and intensely human. She pulled up hard again, the G-forces crushing her into her seat, and she was already planning the 5th and final run. This would be the run that ended it. This would be the run that broke the enemy's back. At 3,000 feet on the final approach, Sarah was moving so fast and so low that the world had become a blur of rock and dust and desperate action. The targeting computer locked onto the last concentrated enemy position. She had seconds to make the decision, to commit to the attack, to put everything into this final pass. She pressed the trigger one final time. The cannon roared, the rounds impacted, the enemy position was obliterated. For a moment there was silence. Then Martinez's voice came through, and it was transformed. It was joy and relief and disbelief all mixed together. "Reaper, enemy fire has ceased. Complete cease. All enemy fire has stopped. Repeat, we are no longer receiving fire from the eastern ridge. You did it. You actually did it. You saved us." Sarah pulled up hard, feeling the crushing G-forces one final time, and pointed her aircraft toward the base. Her hands were shaking now, her entire body shaking with the release of adrenaline and tension and the realization of what she had just accomplished. 12 Marines were alive because of her. 12 men were going home. The flight back to the base felt like it took forever and no time at all. Sarah was operating in a state of dissociation, her body still in the cockpit, her hands still on the controls, her eyes still monitoring instruments, but her mind somewhere else entirely. She kept replaying the moments. The cannon fire, the enemy positions being torn apart, Martinez's voice transforming from desperation to relief. The sky around her was the same sky she'd departed through just 23 minutes earlier, but she was a different person now. The woman who had launched into that sky had been afraid. The woman flying back was transformed by the weight of what she had just accomplished. "Reaper TOC," Colonel Rodriguez's voice came through her headset. "What is your fuel status? Can you make it back to the base?" Sarah checked her fuel gauges. She was running on reserves now, having burned through more fuel than anticipated during the multiple attack passes and the hard maneuvering required to evade enemy fire. "TOC, Reaper," she responded. "Fuel status is critical but sufficient. I will arrive at the base with approximately 15 minutes of fuel remaining. Request clearance for direct approach and immediate landing." Reaper TOC copies, Rodriguez responded. You are cleared for direct approach priority landing. The entire base is standing by. Welcome home, Captain. Welcome home. The words seemed inadequate to describe what was happening. Sarah had left the base as the only available pilot. She was returning as the sole survivor of a major combat operation. The distinction was immense. At 15,000 feet, she could see the base in the distance. The airfield came into view, the runway a thin black line cutting through the desert. Closer, she could see the flight line, could see what looked like an unusual number of personnel gathered outside. They knew. Somehow, despite the radio protocols that were supposed to maintain operational security, they knew what had happened. Bravo Company Reaper, Sarah transmitted one final time. I am returning to base. You are clear to move to extraction point. Medical evacuation is being coordinated now. You did good work down there, all of you. Thank you for holding. Martinez's response came back almost immediately. Reaper, Bravo Company, thank you. Thank you for everything. You gave us our lives back. We will never forget. Bravo Company out. The transmission ended, and Sarah felt something break inside her chest. The emotion that she had been holding back throughout the entire combat engagement suddenly threatened to overwhelm her. She forced it back down, locked it away in a compartment that she would deal with later, after the aircraft was safely on the ground, after she debriefed the mission, after she could afford to feel again. She descended toward the airfield, aligning with the runway, hitting the marks exactly as she had been trained to do. At 2,000 feet, she was lined up perfectly. At 1,000 feet, the runway was expanding beneath her. At 500 feet, she could see personnel in the ready room standing at the windows, watching her approach. She touched down with practiced precision, the landing gear connecting with the runway with a solid thump. The wheels gripped the tarmac, and she began to slow. The aircraft's speed decreased from 200 miles per hour to 100 to 50 to 20. By the time she rolled to a stop on the flight line, she could see the entire operations crew gathered outside, standing in formation, waiting. Sarah taxied to her parking spot and cut the engines. The aircraft shuddered as the turbines spun down, as the power that had carried her through the most intense moments of her life dissipated. The silence was profound. The complete absence of the roar of jet engines left her feeling suddenly empty. She popped the canopy and climbed out of the cockpit. Her legs were unsteady, and she had to grip the edge of the aircraft to steady herself. The ground crew rushed forward, helping her down the ladder, supporting her weight. She was suddenly aware of how completely exhausted she was. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the combat was wearing off, and the biological reality of what her body had endured was asserting itself. Her hands were shaking so badly that she couldn't unfasten her flight suit. A young airman gently took over, helping her remove the heavy gear. Around her, people were speaking, but the words seemed to come from far away. She could see Colonel Rodriguez approaching through the crowd, his face streaked with emotion. "Captain," he said, and his voice was thick with something that might have been pride or might have been overwhelming relief. "You did it. Those 12 Marines are alive because of you." Sarah tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She opened her mouth and closed it, opened it again. Finally, she managed. "I did what needed to be done, sir." "That's what soldiers do," Rodriguez said. "That's what heroes do." The word felt wrong to her. Hero. It seemed like a word that belonged to someone else, someone more confident or more certain or more prepared. She was just a pilot who had done her job, except that her job had involved split-second decisions that meant the difference between 12 families getting their sons home or 12 boxes being returned to America. The operations officer approached with a tablet. "Captain, we're ready to debrief whenever you are. The entire command structure is standing by. The Pentagon is already requesting a full mission report." Sarah nodded, but she couldn't move. She stood there on the flight line, still in her flight suit, still covered in the sweat of combat, and she looked up at the aircraft she'd just landed. The fuselage showed the evidence of the engagement, impact marks where enemy rounds had struck, scorch marks from the cannon fire still warm on the wing pylons. The aircraft looked as exhausted as she felt. "Captain, are you all right?" the operations officer asked. "Yeah," Sarah said quietly. "I'm fine, I need a moment." She walked away from the crowd, away from the questions, away from the immediate demands of the debrief. She walked to the edge of the flight line and looked out at the desert horizon where the sun was beginning to descend toward evening. In less than an hour, it would be dark. In that darkness, 12 Marines would be airlifted to safety. 12 families would get phone calls telling them that their sons were coming home. Because of her, because she had been the only pilot left, because she had answered the call. The full weight of it hit her then. All the fear and doubt and uncertainty that she had pushed aside during the combat engagement came flooding back. She sat down heavily on a concrete barrier and put her head in her hands. Major Patricia Williams found her there 5 minutes later. She sat down beside her without speaking, didn't try to offer platitudes or encouragement. She just sat with her, providing silent support, understanding that sometimes the most heroic thing one person could do for another was simply to be present. 23 minutes, Sarah whispered. That's how long it took, 23 minutes and it was all over. 12 lives, Patricia replied quietly. 12 lives changed in 23 minutes. Sarah looked at her friend and saw the understanding in her eyes. Patricia knew. She understood that heroism wasn't about feeling brave. It was about acting despite the fear. It was about making impossible decisions when there were no good options. It was about sacrificing your own peace of mind for the safety of others. "They're calling you a hero," Patricia said, "and they're right. But I think you already know that deep down. You knew it the moment you climbed into that cockpit. You knew that if you didn't go, those men would die. So you went. And you saved them." Sarah nodded slowly. She thought about the Marines in the valley, about Martinez's voice transforming from desperation to gratitude. She thought about the families who would get to keep their sons. She thought about the moment where the abstract concept of duty had become the concrete reality of combat. She had been the only pilot left, and she had answered the call, and 12 Marines were going home. That would have to be enough.